Welcome to the lecture again this week, and we are looking at what a pest. These are all sorts of animals that were introduced by the Europeans over the years, over the centuries as they moved into Australia, and animals that really interfered with our ecology, with the way we had crops, with trees, and also with our native animals. So we will be looking at the camels, the rabbits, foxes, and one of the most destructive, the cane toad. Before we get into the pests that are really a problem for Australia, we perhaps need to start by looking at the top 10 pests worldwide. Now, some of these are in Australia as well, so we'll have a look at the ones that are outside Australia. One of them is, or the top one worldwide, is actually kudzu. And this is called the Marla minute vine, and also the vine that ate the south. So it's a native to Japan, but they first brought it into the United States in 1876. It was featured in magazines as a very tough and fast-growing vine that could help stop eroding soil. And so it was brought across into the States. However, what they failed to mention was when they said fast-growing, it actually is growing like lightning. And also, it grows over anything. It will grow over a house, fences, trees, parks, gardens. And since its introduction, it's been spreading across America at a rate as fast as 150,000 acres every year. It can grow up to 1 foot or 30 centimetres every day. And so, really a problem plant wherever it's been introduced. The black rat, no surprise, is also one of the first invasive species ever to be accidentally spread by humans. It came originally from tropical Asia, but it got as far as Europe even in the 1st century AD. And that was across land, so it was a very good traveller. But then, of course, once ships started sailing and going from continent to continent, the black rat got onto ships, and then, of course, it got a free ride. And since then, it has absolutely thrived in every area of the world. The bad thing about this black rat is that it can live anywhere. In cities, in towns, countrysides, deserts, tropical areas. So it just adapts itself to any environment. Unfortunately, the rise of this rat has meant the extinction of numbers of birds, reptiles, and other small animals all over the world. We then have another life that came also from Asia, and this is the tiger mosquito. It's called a tiger mosquito obviously because of its black and white striping. So native originally to Southeast Asia, but it's one of the most widely distributed animal species, now in about 28 countries across the world. It actually spreads through international tire trade. The tires that are stored outside, they get rainwater in them, and this is an ideal breeding and living condition for the mosquito, so that when tires, because the rubber plantations are in Asia, when the tires are then put into containers and shipped all over the globe, these mosquitoes go with them. It is responsible for a dengue fever, a mosquito fever, and the dengue fever, once you catch it, you never actually get rid of it. You actually have that virus in your blood system forever. So it associates near humans, and it does feed 24 hours a day. This little mosquito doesn't sleep. Other pests worldwide are the snakehead fish. This is a revolting looking fish. You can see it does really look like a snake. It's a nightmarish animal. Snakehead fish are really little eating machines. They have sharp, shark-like teeth. They have an appetite for blood, and they can grow to over 3 feet in length. They can lay up to 75,000 eggs a year, and they can even breathe and migrate on land as well as in the water. So it might leave the water to look for another body of water, and it can live on land for up to 4 days because it also has a very primitive breathing organ, a little bit like a lung. Once again, they were originally from East Asian waters, but they have absolutely decimated a lot of native food chains in the USA. The longhorned beetle might be the top of many people's list. Once again, it comes from Asia, and it actually spends most of its destructive period as a larva. And in this time, it tunnels under trees and it eats on the layers of trees, their bark and their wood. And if there are enough number of these larvae, they can actually kill the whole tree. So while it was originally in countries like Japan, infestations were also first found in America in 1996. It quickly spread across the entire East Coast, and now they threaten about 35% of all the trees in the US on that Atlantic coast. So quite a destructive little beetle. The Burmese python is always a good example of what can happen if a large predatory species can be introduced into an environment where the other native life doesn't have any protection to it. So this python can grow up to 20 feet in length, and even though it was native to Southeast Asia, they're really quite at home both on land and in water. They were accidentally introduced into Florida, and now they do so well in Florida. They think that there are about 30,000 of these. They can eat birds and, yes, even alligators. So they are quite high on the food chain as a predator. We also have the Nile perch, and again, this is a water organism. It's common to a lot of freshwater African lake and river systems. It was introduced into Africa in the 1950s, but the whole lake system wasn't really ready for it. And it's popular because it didn't have other fish any bigger that could destroy it. The population totally exploded. And this led to the extinction of several hundred native water life in the area. It grows up to 2 meters. It can weigh over 200 kilometers. And so it obviously is a huge destroyer in this part of Africa. So we are now going to move into Australia, and 3 of the top 10 destroyers worldwide are going to be what we are looking at today as introduced into Australia. We are going to look at the Australian brumbies, a huge problem in Victoria, foxes, rabbits, camels and cane toads. And the foxes, rabbits and cane toads are a feral problem to every country that they've been introduced. But these, we're going to have a look to see how these have affected the Australian ecosystem and environment. The first animal we're going to look at that has caused a problem in Australia is probably an unusual one. It's the brumby, or the wild horse. Horses were introduced into Australia with the first fleet, and obviously they were a really important animal to be used for farm work, for transport, and also for just travelling from city to city, town to town. However, they have become a problem in one state, and this is in Victoria, which is the state where Melbourne is found. In the mountain areas in Victoria, we have some beautiful highlands, and some brumbies escaped and have become quite widespread in this part of the Victorian landscape. So they've actually made this national park area their home. and you can see some of them roaming wild here through the bushland. Horses are not native to high country or to mountain areas, and so when they run free in an area like this, they can be really very, very destructive. They gallop, they churn up the soil, any of the wetlands, the marshes or the rivers, they destroy the natural water flow in those areas. So it's not only what the animals do, but also the numbers of them. This national park is not very large, but they do fly over the park and try to get an idea of the numbers of these brumbies to keep them in control. And the most recent aerial flight showed up to 2,500 horses or wild brumbies in the Alpine National Park. And the main part of the park that needs protecting, the Barmah National Park, has about 300 of them. And as I said, long term, they cause a severe degradation or breaking down of any wetland areas like marshes, ponds, waterways such as the rivers, and a lot of the damage they do can't be recovered while those brumbies are still there. So obviously that is a problem. However, they are part of our history. And in the bottom picture here, you can see the scene from a movie that was made in this area, and it was called The Man from Snowy River. And the movie was all about a horse handler who started catching and taming some of the wild brumbies in this area. A movie that has excellent kind of horse riding scenes. So a pest, but also part of our cultural history. The first animal we're looking at that was introduced are the foxes. They were brought practically from the first fleet, the first ships arriving from England onwards. And they brought them for sport. They wanted to be able to have fox hunting like they did back in the UK. So they brought some foxes with them, and the aim was to let them go loose and then you hunt them for sport, shoot at them. But of course foxes are very clever. Quite a few escaped. They got into the natural environment, and they've been a problem ever since. Some people say that they're cute and cuddly and they're on the same level of having a pet like a cat and a dog, but they aren't. Foxes are more foe than friend. They are a natural predator. They're not a pet. So even if you have them at home and you brought them up from a cub, if you let them out at night, instinctively they will hunt and they will kill animals. So it is a beautiful creature, but not one that you can stop from hunting. Highly destructive and mainly attacks on livestock, cattle, sheep, goats and horses. The problem became so bad that in 2014 the New South Wales government declared war on foxes, and they wrote a pest control order. The aim is to try and stop people from having foxes as a pet, and to try and phase out this ownership and then protect more livestock. There are 70 licensed fox owners in New South Wales, but when those 70 die, there will be no new licenses, and then it'll be against the law to own a fox. As I said, the destruction is huge. In Australia, they cause around $230 million worth of damage every year, and about 40 million of that is just inflicted on livestock, on the cattle, the horses, the sheep and the goats. So it does have a huge impact, and it's something that the government is really trying to reel in. Foxes in Australia. Well, the red foxes were introduced into all the colonies in Australia as early as 1833, and mostly they were brought into the Sydney regions of New South Wales, and it was all for the purpose of fox hunting. The people who had migrated from England, especially those who were of higher caste, those who were higher born, fox hunting was a part of the nobility in England, so they wanted to have that same tradition here. It was not originally established in Tasmania because in Tasmania you had an animal, the Tasmanian devil, and the Tasmanian devil was too strong a predator for the fox, and so any foxes introduced there didn't survive. Because the Tasmanian devil is an apex predator. It was at the top of the chain. However, in the rest of the continent, they soon spread quite well. So they are in all states except Tasmania. They are found now in even densely populated suburban areas. And in large cities such as Melbourne, foxes have become a real problem. They will go through garbage bins, for example, and they will also attack pets, especially cats and dogs. The fox, though, is less common in areas where there is a dingo, because the dingo is also an apex predator, and the fox and the dingo, they don't go very well together. And often the fox will just look for another ecology, another habitat to live in, and not fight against the dingo. The fox, though, has led to the extinction of a huge number of native species. These include small types of kangaroo, the desert rat kangaroo. It's like bilbies, numbats, wallabies, quokkas. These are all animals that perhaps aren't very familiar to you, but they are really important, small, quite often desert-dwelling animals that are part of our original habitat. And the foxes have practically wiped a lot of those out of lots of areas. What's also disturbing is that the foxes learnt to climb trees, and now koalas and possums are also under threat. And you can see here a picture of a fox curled up and sleeping in a tree. So the koalas and the possums, which previously, they were never under threat from dingoes, because dingoes preferred other animals and they were usually safe in trees. So the fox has adapted really well to habitats, and that's what's making it an even more dangerous predator right across the continent, except for Tasmania. We're now going to step away from the lecture for a few moments and watch a really interesting interview about foxes in Australia. It's only a short YouTube clip, but remember to come back to this lecture after watching the YouTube clip. So the rabbits in Australia, as we know, they were first brought into 1859, and there were 13 wild rabbits introduced just to be hunted for sport. They were introduced in Victoria. They spread incredibly quickly. They bred and they moved from that original spot in Victoria right into all sorts of farming land, desert lands, and very soon they had occupied the entire continent from east coast to west coast. To put that into perspective, they did this within 50 years across the entire length and breadth of Australia. It took 700 years for the rabbit to do that in the UK, and the UK is a much smaller island. At the moment, we are home to 150 million of these rabbits, and the issue is that they can survive on almost any crop. Anything that a farmer grows, a rabbit will eat. It's not terribly fussy, so it will destroy any crop that it comes across. The only time there was a real drop in the number of rabbits was during the 1930s, and this was the time of depression in Australia, where many people lost their jobs, there wasn't enough money, and people had to start hunting small animals just to put meat on the table to eat, to feed their families. Some people started setting rabbit traps or shooting rabbits and then going around to the suburbs and selling this as a food for people to eat, to cook into stews and to bake. The people who did this were called the rabbitoes. So basically, many farmers have been eaten off the land. The rabbit will eat anything. And the long-term result of this is that there's overgrazing of a lot of their land. There has been a collapse of indigenous plants, native plants in Australia, and a collapse of the native animal species that used to live on these plants. With excessive or overgrazing, this leads to soil erosion, the pasture yields drop, and the water quality is much poorer. And now it's estimated that these rabbits cost the Australian economy over $200 million a year. Definitely a pest. So the rabbits were definitely causing a huge problem for Australian farmers and therefore a problem to the governments. The first thing the government did in 1943 was that they introduced a virus called myxomatosis. And this only targeted rabbits, or they thought so. They hadn't thoroughly tested it, but it was correct. It only targeted rabbits. Initially, the first 10 years, this had a great effect on the rabbit population. But some of the rabbits that survived obviously were the ones who had genes that were resistant to it. And over the next 20 years, we found that all of the rabbits were then resistant to myxomatosis. In 1995, they introduced another virus into the rabbit population called calcivirus. And again, this had a short-term effect, but then again, rabbits became resistant to it. The other thing that the government tried to do was building extensive fences. And they did this first in central New South Wales. And these fences would go for hundreds and hundreds of kilometres. And the idea was that it would stop the rabbits from getting from one side of the fence to the other. A good idea, but it was sometimes the rabbits were already on the other side of the fence. And the other problem they found was that often the fences were damaged by other wild animals, mainly by kangaroos. And the upkeep and repair of these fences just cost a fortune. The most iconic fence or barrier was the rabbit-proof fence that was built between 1901 and 1907 in Western Australia. And this fence is actually over 3,000 kilometres long, and it goes from north to south in Western Australia. It's also the name, the rabbit-proof fence is also the name of an iconic Australian movie about Indigenous peoples in that state. So yes, the rabbit-proof fences in an attempt to control the pest that is costing so much money every year. We're going to step away from the lecture just for a few minutes and watch a short YouTube clip. This one is a scientific one. It's from the CSIRO, which is our government environmental body, and they are going to give you more information about attempts to control rabbits in Australia. Remember to return to this lecture once you've watched this short YouTube clip. The next pest that gets invited into Australia or imported were the camels. They first started importing camels in the 1840s, and unlike the rabbits and the foxes that were going to be used for hunting and for game, the camel was actually used for a purpose. The majority of Australia, once you get away from the coast, is desert. And the people who started trying to explore the deserts, to cross the deserts, very quickly realised that taking horses or mules was really not going to work. These animals just couldn't survive the dry, and they were not really suitable to walking across desert sands. And so camels were imported for these pioneers, for these explorers. And the first two that did this were a very famous pair of explorers called Burke and Wills. And they were going on an expedition in South Australia, heading into the Great Sandy Desert, and they brought in camels, which they thought would be the best option for them to be able to survive. They also realised fairly soon that you needed people specialised in handling camels and also being able to train them. And so Muslim cameleers first started arriving in 1860. The camels themselves mainly came from India, and the cameleers, the people who could train and manage the camels, mainly came from Afghanistan and from Pakistan. So every 3 years, this was so successful that every 3 years after the 1860s, groups arrived in 3-year intervals, and they just needed more and more cameleers to satisfy the needs. After the initial group of explorers, Burke and Wills, they then discovered, yes, the camels were great going through the desert areas. They could cart goods from one town to another. They could transport wool bales, for example. The cameleers very quickly gained knowledge of the outback conditions and also the economy. So some Muslim cameleers began their own businesses, And again, this is why every 3 years they needed to bring in more cameleers to replace those that went into industry, or even to help out as extra cameleers. Because they came originally from Pakistan or Afghanistan, a lot of them were called Afghans, or just simply Gans. As well as helping the Australian people in the outback towns by transporting goods, the Gans also helped the Aborigines. And the Gans and Aborigines developed a very, very close and very easy relationship. They exchanged skills, they exchanged knowledge. For example, in the desert where water was to be found, where plants could be found for the camels to eat, and also goods. Both had a very similar love of the land and a respect for animals, and so this relationship was quite an easy one for them to develop. The camels in Australia very quickly spread, mainly because they were very much needed by all the population. The cameleers, as I said, also worked very well with the Australian Indigenous people. When the Indigenous population first saw camels, they were quite horrified, but after their shock wore off, they found that the horse was an ignorant animal and the camel was very clever. And of course, they had a very easy relationship with the cameleers. So the cameleers carried some of the traditional goods for the Aboriginal people, red ochre or the narcotic plant pituri, and would take those across desert lands to other Aboriginal groups for trade. So it was a very good relationship. The cameleers also brought in new commodities. They would bring in for the Aboriginal people sugar, tea, tobacco, clothing, metal tools. And so these things then gradually reached very remote Aboriginal groups and helped them to move further forward. The Aboriginal people used camel hair, and they used that in their traditional string weavings. And they provided, the Aboriginal people gave information about where water and plants could be found in the desert. So as I said, it was a really lovely relationship between the two. So the camels started spreading across Australia, and as I said, there was a really lovely relationship between the cameleers and the Aboriginal people. The cameleers often employed Aboriginal help on their long desert treks. The Aboriginal people understood where water was to be found, and they could actually navigate across the deserts, and they knew where food was to be found for the camel. And of course, the cameleers trained the camels and could herd the camels, could manage the camels much better. With this good relationship, camels also started appearing in Aboriginal art, which is interesting because white people were never included in Aboriginal art in these areas. In the 1920s and 1930s, camels started getting replaced by motor transport. And this would be cars as well as large trucks. And so a lot of the cameleers became displaced. And some of the Aboriginal people took over the camels themselves, but a lot of the cameleers just let their animals go. They released them into the wild. And this became perhaps the next step of where the camels really became a problem. The camel was obviously well suited to arid conditions, and it became the source. This became the source for a large population of these feral or wild camels. Their impact on the environment is not quite as severe as other pests, but they do ingest or eat 80% of all the plant species available. They don't degrade the landscape as much as other animals because they have very soft pads on their feet. However, we are the only country with feral or wild herds, and we have the largest population of wild camels in the world. Even though they don't have as huge an impact on the actual environment, they do a lot of damage. They're a huge animal and they're a strong animal. And they do infrastructure damage. They damage taps, pumps, things that are on some of these farms in these remote areas. They will even damage toilets as a means of obtaining water in extreme drought. They will damage stock fences and any cattle watering points. And
This damage is felt very, very strongly by a lot of the Aboriginal and other remote communities, where the costs of doing repairs for any of this damage is really, really tough for them. So, yes, they are not overly damaging the desert itself, but they are damaging the infrastructure. One thing that they are used for is one positive impact is on tourism. So we have camel safaris through the Red Centre, camel safaris over on the west coast of Western Australia, and also camel races once a year, which bring in a lot of tourists and tourist dollars. Now I'd like you to step away from the vodcast just for a few minutes and look at a YouTube clip about the impact of camels. It is a cool green science clip, so it's very interesting. You may need to watch it twice if you need to listen a second time. Remember to come back to this lecture after watching this YouTube clip on the impact of camels. And this brings us to the last of our imported pests into the country, and this one I find the most grotesque and horrible and insidious. It's the cane toad, and there's a picture of a cane toad here. They were originally brought into Queensland, and you can see here at certain times of year when we have a lot of wet weather, these cane toads will start hopping everywhere and in huge numbers, like you can see on the road here. They are quite a large toad, and not only are they very unattractive, they're also very dangerous. So this guy here is picking two up, but you do have to pick them up very carefully. This girl is doing the correct thing, using gloves. Glad to see she's horrified. And the cane toad in all its meanness and horridness. So we hope you enjoy now learning a little bit about the other introduced pest, the cane toad.
So, what are cane toads? Well, they are amphibians. Now, amphibians are creatures that live part of their life in the water and part of their life on land. Usually the first part of their life is on water and the second part of their life is on land. And essentially they're always connected to water throughout their lives. There's a difference between frogs and toads. Now, frogs tend to be smaller, a lot slimier. They lay their eggs in clumps, much like a bunch of grapes to look at. And they have longer legs and can jump higher. Toad is larger, has drier, leatherier skin, shorter legs, and they lay their eggs usually in long strands. So there's some differences between frogs and toads. Now, the cane toad originated in Central America, around the area of Venezuela and the Caribbean. And that's where it comes from. That's its environment. That's its habitat. So when you take cane toads out of their environment and put them in other areas such as Australia, they can do a lot of damage. They came to Australia from Hawaii. They had been taken to Hawaii previously in order to, well, support Hawaii's sugarcane industry, because Hawaii, like Australia, has a favourable climate for sugarcane. And so budding entrepreneurs took the cane toad from Central America to Hawaii, where they had a different sort of success to what we've had here in Australia.
Thank you, AJ. I want you now to step away from the lecture for a few minutes and watch a scientific YouTube clip. And it's all about the invasion of these deadly toads into Australia. Remember to return back to this lecture once you've finished watching.
Breeding and tadpoles. We can't really talk about cane toads without talking about how they reproduce. Breeding is when animals reproduce to make young, and tadpoles are young toads and young frogs. In a single season, a female toad can lay up to about 40,000 eggs. That's a lot of eggs. And the eggs hatch into tadpoles. Now, in the natural environment, only about 2 of these eggs would survive into adulthoods. However, in Australia, which is not the natural environment for the cane toad, a lot more survive into adulthood. And that's because in Australia, the cane toad is more of an apex predator, or a serious predator. In Australia, you can have so many cane toads laying eggs that ponds can become black with the eggs of cane toads. That's a big problem for this country. Now, the process from tadpoles into frogs, essentially a tadpole hatches from the egg. As it does that, is essentially just a body and a tail. Over time, it grows 2 hind legs. Hind means in the back, in the rear. And then the head starts to get bigger, the tail begins to shrink, and it grows 2 front legs. And then when the tail is completely gone, the tadpole resembles a baby toad or a baby frog and will jump forth from the water. Now, native Australian amphibians, i.e. frogs and toads, they mature more slowly than cane toads. So whereas a cane toad might become or becomes a toad, a fully grown adult, more quickly than a native toad or frog, a native toad or frog emerges from the lakes, from the water, etc., and finds that the cane toad is there waiting for it, and in many cases will eat the native animal or the native toad or frog. As a result, the cane toad is supplanting native species. So there are fewer and fewer native frogs and native toads, and ever more cane toads. In essence, Australia's native animals are becoming a food source for the cane toad. So the cane and its grub. Now on the top right hand side you can see an image of a cane beetle and its grub. The same way that a maggot grows into a fly and a caterpillar grows into a butterfly or a moth, what we have here is a grub which goes into its beetle. Its Latin name is Dermolepida albuhirtum. It's a native Australian insect, so it wasn't actually brought here. And in Australia, it lived off of cane plants in the north of the country. So when sugarcane was brought here, it throve. It enjoyed the highly nutritious content of sugarcane and increased in quantity. The beetle itself eats the leaves of the sugarcane, so it lives high in the plant and eats the leaves of the plant, thereby compromising the plant itself, by breaking it down so it can't reach a stage where humans can cultivate it or can harvest it. The larvae, the babies of the grub, live or they hatch underground and they eat the roots of the plant. So together with the adults in the leaves and the babies under the ground eating the roots, they can do serious damage to the sugarcane harvest. So why were the cane toads introduced to Australia? Well, until the 1930s, there were problems with the cane grub consuming the sugarcane. So the beetles were eating the roots, and the grubs were eating the roots, and the beetles were eating the leaves of the sugarcane. Now, in Puerto Rico in 1932, there was a conference, and this conference spoke about the benefits of cane toads to control the cane grub. People were saying how they've had big success with this toad eating pesky beetles and grubs in other parts of the world. And as a result, a suggestion was made to bring the cane toads to Australia. They thought, wow, we could bring them to Australia and we could solve our problem of the cane grubs and the cane beetle destroying the sugarcane plantations. So the suggestion was made to go to Hawaii to catch some cane toads, bring them to Australia and solve all our problems. Now, scientists and environmentalists were strongly opposed to this, even back in the 1930s. They said, no, this is a horrible idea. What are you doing? It won't work. But people don't listen to reason, they listen to money. And so in 1935, a bunch of cane toads were released at a pond near Cairns. These toads had been brought to Australia from Hawaii. And after that, a few more were released at some other selected sites around Australia. And the rest, as they say, is history. So, problems with the cane toad. Well, as you might imagine, there are plenty of problems with the cane toad, not least of which I've just talked about. The major problem, the first thing they realized back in the 1930s, was that the cane toads were not doing their job. They were brought here to eat the cane grub and the cane beetle, and they did neither. The reason is because the beetles eat the leaves at the top of the cane, and the cane toads live at the bottom of the cane, so they can't reach them. Also, grubs live under the ground, and the cane toads don't dig. So the problems that the environmentalists and the scientists had back in the 30s, saying that cane toads would be a bad idea, well, nobody listened to them, even though the scientists and the environmentalists knew quite well that the cane toad would be completely ineffective in Australia. Now, cane toads reproduce very quickly. I've just shown you that they have 40,000 eggs in a season, and many of these eggs reach maturity. And they eat lots of things, including the native animals. Now, a native animal might eat the cane toad because animals prey on other animals, but they die. So birds, snakes, crocodiles, whereas they eat a native frog or a native toad, for them that's just a meal. But they eat a cane toad and they die. I wonder why. Many dogs also eat the toads and die. So your pet might put a cane toad in its mouth, shake it around, and then drop dead. A dingo could do the same. The reason is because cane toads are poisonous. They have poison on their backs. So if you are an animal and you eat a cane toad, the cane toad releases its poison and you die very quickly. If you are a person and you touch a cane toad, it's going to most likely release some sort of toxin onto your skin. So after you've been touching a cane toad, you should wash your hands thoroughly. Cane toads are not only apex predators, they are also deadly if you eat them. And for this reason, they are a huge pain in Australia.
Thank you, AJ. Yes, the cane toads brought from Hawaii to eat the beetle do not eat the beetle, so the cane farms, sugar cane farms, still have a problem. But the cane toad eats other things. It eats a lot of indigenous plants and a lot of native animals. And it quickly spread from Queensland across the top of Northern Australia, all the way across to Perth. They've even seen cane toads now moving south into New South Wales, into Sydney. And the real fear from the government is these cane toads are going to totally spread across our entire habitat. And at the moment, there's very little that we can do to stop them. You can kill them, but it really has to be by hand. And of course, it has to be humanely. So the Australian government authorities, they're constantly putting out a prize. If anyone can think of an easy way to kill the cane toad without damaging the environment, they would actually earn themselves quite a lot of money.
So, some solutions to the problem of cane toads. Now, if you're traveling around the country, it's very important that you check your vehicle for cane toads, especially if you're traveling out of areas where cane toads have already reached. So you might be traveling south into New South Wales or west into South Australia, and you're doing so in a rental car or maybe a car that you've bought. You must check your luggage to ensure that no cane toad has snuck into it. They're great stowaways, which means they're very adept at getting to places where they shouldn't be, maybe jumping into the back of a car or getting to your bag. You get to where you're going, you might not realize it, but the cane toad has come with you and then jumps out of your bag. So you must check your vehicle and your luggage thoroughly before traveling out of cane toad prone areas. Some examples of places to look are here: boxes, crates and pallets, building materials, camping equipment. So you might actually pack up your camping equipment in one place without realizing that you've captured a cane toad in your camping equipment and you transport it to a new area. Vehicles, trailers and caravans, boats. So if you are traveling with a boat, check under the floor or in bait boxes. Pipes. Pipes are round and they're often dark, so a cane toad might jump into one. And potted plants. Yes, they like to hide under upside down pot plants or in empty pots. It's protection from the sun and often cooler. So that's a nice little environment for the cane toad to hide.
This is other information that the government puts out, making sure that children especially are protected in areas where the cane toads, and also what to do if you have an animal that accidentally picks up a cane toad. So there is a special contact phone number you can ring 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The cane toad has the toxin, the poison on its skin. And when you touch a cane toad, this squirts out. It's its defense mechanism to protect itself. If it squirts out onto a human, they have to go immediately to hospital, to an emergency department. If a child accidentally swallows some, then it increases the heart, the blood pressure. They have problems breathing. They might start twitching and vomiting. And it's very rapid, so all of these will start showing these symptoms within 15 minutes. If you're going to remove a cane toad from your garden or somewhere, they say always have gloves on, and you always pick it up in a certain way because you've got to know where these glands are. If a pet has bitten a cane toad or picked it up in its mouth, they will start trembling or shaking. They might have difficulty breathing. They will stagger or be very not very natural in the way that they're walking. And if that happens, then they can very quickly go into a coma and die. So it's important to wash out the animal's mouth. And also in areas when it's cane toad season, which is the tropical season, lots of rain, maybe if you're in a cane toad area, not to let your dog out at night. Maybe keep it chained or keep it inside the house. So it is a very, very big risk to children and animals in the cane toad areas, especially in the wet season. So even though you have this horrid cane toad that has been brought into Australia to try and control the cane beetle and has ended up destroying so much of our native habitat, we still have a sense of humour. I would like you to step away from the lecture one last time and watch this ad that was on Australian TV a few years ago. It's about two cane toads sitting in the middle of the road. We hope you enjoy it, and remember to come back to this lecture as soon as you've finished watching. Thank you for watching this week. We hope you've got a little bit more understanding of the imported animals that the original people into Australia and farmers later brought in, that have totally devastated economically and environmentally our lovely country. It's also perhaps one reason why we have our border control, and they're so very fastidious and fussy about checking people's luggage and making sure that there are no seeds and no animals even that are being smuggled into Australia. Remember to click on the link for your reading task, and then below that your link for the lecture task. We look forward to being with you again next week.